The Road to Yozgad. In April 1916, following the devastating siege of Kut in Mesopotamia, 2nd Lieutenant E.H. Jones of the Indian Army, a role he had embraced with professional pride, found himself a prisoner of the Ottoman Empire. Stripped of his weapon and dignity, he was forced on a brutal death march across the scorching desert before being packed into a filthy cattle truck for a grueling rail journey into the heart of Anatolia. His destination was the Yozgad POW camp, a collection of dilapidated houses in a remote town, hundreds of miles from any friendly border or coastline. The camp was a prison of deliberate isolation, designed to crush the spirit long before any escape attempt could be conceived. Barbed wire was almost an afterthought. The vast, hostile Turkish landscape was the real jailer. Jones, a man with a quiet, pre-war fascination for stage magic and psychological trickery, observed his grim new home not with an eye for physical escape routes, but for mental weaknesses. He saw bored guards, a profoundly superstitious local population, and fellow officers slowly succumbing to a deep, draining despair that was more corrosive than any fence. He knew that digging a tunnel or cutting a wire here wouldn't lead to freedom, but to a shallow, unmarked grave in the Anatolian dust. A different, more audacious kind of plan was needed. The surrender at Kut on 29th April 1916 had been a catastrophic humiliation. Major General Charles Townshend capitulated to Ottoman forces after a 5-month siege that left his British and Indian troops starving and riddled with disease. Jones and thousands of others laid down their rifles and walked into the waiting arms of their Turkish captors. The initial shame of defeat burned less than what immediately followed. Turkish guards, with systematic cruelty, stripped them of valuables, tore insignia from their uniforms, and forced the long column of defeated men onto a death march northward under a merciless sun. The sand burned through the thin soles of their boots. Men collapsed hourly. Turkish soldiers callously prodded the fallen with rifle butts. Those who couldn't rise stayed where they fell, their forms quickly shrinking against the shimmering horizon. Jones kept moving, one agonizing step at a time. His legs screamed a protest that his mind refused to hear. His lips cracked and bled. He watched officers he'd served beside for years, men of discipline and pride, reduced to stumbling, hollow-eyed skeletons. At night, they were herded into filthy, ancient caravanserais where dysentery and typhus spread like wildfire in the suffocating dark. The Ottomans provided almost no food, no medicine, no mercy. This was not just imprisonment, it was calculated punishment for resisting their empire. After 3 weeks of marching, the skeletal survivors were loaded into cattle trucks at Baghdad. Jones squeezed into a wooden car designed for livestock, packed so tightly that men couldn't sit, only lean against each other in a heaving mass of misery. The air turned thick and foul within minutes, a suffocating mixture of sweat, fear, and excrement. The train lurched north toward Anatolia, its constant rocking and the groaning of the wooden car becoming a maddening rhythm. Days blurred into a nauseating cycle of darkness and blinding light when the doors were briefly opened. Men urinated where they stood. The stronger, by instinct and compassion, held up the weaker to prevent them from being trampled underfoot. At irregular stops, guards flung open the doors and dead bodies, stiffened in their upright positions, tumbled onto the tracks. Jones counted 7 from his truck alone before he stopped counting, the act itself becoming too much to bear. The living began to envy the dead. The journey took 10 agonizing days. When the doors finally slid open at Angora, Jones's legs barely functioned. Guards shouted and drove them into a transit camp where they spent 2 more weeks in tents crawling with lice before being dispersed to permanent camps across central Turkey. Jones and roughly 200 other British officers boarded another train in mid-June. Their final destination remained ominously unknown. The locomotive chugged east through barren hills and scattered, timeless villages that seemed untouched by the 20th century. After 2 days, the train slowed and stopped at a desolate station. A simple sign read Yozgad. Guards shouted in Turkish, their commands sharp and impatient. Officers grabbed their meagre possessions and climbed down onto a dusty platform. The town before them looked medieval. Flat-roofed mud-brick houses clustered around a fortress on a hill. Elegant minarets pierced a vast cloudless sky. The altitude made the air thin and surprisingly cold despite summer approaching. A ring of mountains on the distant horizon sealed them in. Jones scanned the landscape and understood immediately with a cold dread that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Escape from this place would not follow conventional rules. The camp itself was a cruel joke. No purpose-built barracks existed here. The Ottomans had simply requisitioned several ramshackle houses on the edge of town and declared them a prisoner of war camp. A token barbed wire fence separated the houses from the rest of Yozgad, but the real insurmountable barrier was geography. The town sat isolated on the Anatolian plateau, roughly 3,000 feet above sea level, surrounded by hundreds of miles of hostile territory in every direction. Constantinople lay a daunting 300 miles northwest. The Russian lines before the revolution had been even farther. The Mediterranean coast was weeks of treacherous travel south through mountains and enemy territory. No Allied POW had ever escaped successfully from central Anatolia. The Turks knew it, the prisoners knew it, and the knowledge was a poison. Jones was assigned to House 15 with 40 other officers. The building had been a modest Turkish residence before the war. Rooms designed for a single family now housed dozens of men. There were no beds, only bare, splintered floors. Officers spread their thin blankets on planks or directly on the packed dirt. The roof leaked when it rained, creating muddy puddles among the sleeping forms. Windows had no glass, only rickety wooden shutters that did nothing against the creeping chill. A single primitive latrine served the entire house, overflowing within days. The stench became another prisoner, an inescapable presence. Men wrapped scarves around their faces at night, a futile gesture. Jones chose a corner spot in a room with 7 others. He spread his blanket on the wooden floor and sat down, his back touching the cold wall. This would be home. The guards were a motley mix of Turkish soldiers and local gendarmes, most of them older men or those deemed unfit for frontline service. They treated the British officers with a peculiar combination of contempt and bored indifference. Morning roll call, called yoklama, happened at unpredictable times, a deliberate disruption of routine. Officers lined up outside their houses while Turkish sergeants counted heads with theatrical slowness. Any perceived delay brought screaming in Turkish and occasional sharp jabs from a rifle butt. The commandant, a portly colonel named Majir Osman Bey, appeared rarely and cared even less, viewing his post as a tiresome exile. His second-in-command, a sour lieutenant named Moisi, supervised daily operations with the weary disdain of a man trapped in his own prison, his boredom making him both predictable and dangerously erratic. The guards understood their posting to Yozgad was a dead-end assignment. Many slept during duty or wandered into town for hours. Discipline was inconsistent. Punishments were arbitrary and severe. Food arrived in quantities calculated to sustain life but crush hope. Breakfast was a chunk of hard black bread and thin weak tea. Lunch was a watery soup with occasional unidentifiable scraps of mutton fat floating on top. Dinner was an exact replica of lunch. Officers pooled their dwindling resources to buy supplemental food from local merchants at wildly inflated prices, but their money ran out quickly. The constant, gnawing hunger did more than weaken their bodies. It eroded civility, turning allies into rivals in the desperate calculus of survival. Jones watched men who'd once commanded hundreds of soldiers reduced to fighting over bread crusts. Weight dropped from every frame. Cheekbones emerged like blades. Eyes sank into dark sockets. Dysentery remained epidemic. The camp had no proper medical facilities, only a captured British doctor with no supplies. Men died from preventable illnesses. The Turks buried them in a rocky field outside town with no ceremony, their graves marked only by a pile of stones. But in the gloom of despair, Jones noticed something the others missed. The guards were superstitious, deeply, profoundly superstitious. He observed it first during a thunderstorm when a Turkish sergeant made elaborate protective gestures and muttered prayers to ward off lightning. Later, he overheard guards discussing jinn and evil spirits with complete, unfeigned seriousness. The local population was even more steeped in ancient beliefs. Yozgad was an isolated conservative town where folklore held stronger than in cosmopolitan Constantinople. While others saw only Turkish guards, Jones began to see an audience. Jones had studied stage magic and mentalism before the war as a hobby. He had learned the subtle arts of suggestion, cold reading, and psychological manipulation. He'd performed at regimental parties, amazing fellow officers with apparent mind-reading and prophecy. Those skills had been light entertainment. Here, they could become weapons. By July, the camp had settled into a grinding, soul-destroying routine. Officers rose at dawn, yoklama, breakfast, hours of crushing nothingness, lunch, more nothing, dinner, sleep, repeat. Some men organized lectures on subjects they remembered from university. Others taught languages. A few attempted to maintain military discipline and bearing, though it felt increasingly absurd in their squalor. Jones noticed the psychological deterioration accelerating. Officers sat for hours staring at walls, their faces blank. Conversations died mid-sentence. Laughter became rare, then vanished completely. The isolation worked on the mind like acid. Some men wept quietly in their sleep, others stopped speaking entirely. The camp was crushing spirits exactly as designed. But despair creates opportunity for those willing to see it. Jones befriended another officer, Lieutenant C.W. Hill of the Royal Flying Corps, who'd been shot down over Mesopotamia. Hill possessed a sharp, analytical mind and a cynical sense of humor that had somehow survived captivity. They talked during the long, empty hours, discovering shared observations. The guards were lazy. The camp security was theatrical rather than functional. The commandant was more interested in profit than prisoners, and most importantly, the Turkish psyche had exploitable pressure points that physical force could never reach. Other camps saw prisoners digging tunnels and cutting wire. Those attempts invariably ended in recapture or death. Yozgad demanded something unprecedented. Jones began experimenting with extreme care. He borrowed a makeshift Ouija board an officer had constructed from cardboard and a shard of glass. Several prisoners used it for amusement, asking the spirits trivial questions, while guards watched with a mixture of suspicion and uneasy fascination. Jones saw its potential. He studied the guards' reactions, their eyes widening when the glass spelled out messages. Under the flickering light of a makeshift oil lamp, the séances became a coveted illicit entertainment, but for Jones they were dress rehearsals. He began making small predictions based on careful observation and educated guesses. He told one guard, whose anxiety was palpable, that a letter from home was coming. It arrived 3 days later. Pure luck, but the guard's eyes widened in awe. Jones told another suffering from stomach pains that his condition would worsen unless he ate less of the camp's bread. The man's dysentery predictably worsened. Coincidence, but the guards started avoiding Jones with a new nervous respect. By August, Jones had a partner in Hill and a method forming in his mind. They couldn't walk out of Yozgad. The landscape prevented it. They couldn't tunnel under the wire. The ground was too hard, and the watchtowers offered clear lines of sight. They couldn't overpower the guards. They were malnourished and outnumbered, but they could manipulate belief. They could weaponize superstition. They could create a psychological escape route by making the Turks themselves want certain prisoners gone. It would require immense patience, a flawless performance, and an absolute commitment to the deception. One mistake would mean discovery, torture, or execution, but the alternative was rotting in these houses until the war ended or they died, whichever came first. Jones looked around the filthy room at the broken men slowly giving up. He thought of the guards outside, bored and superstitious, craving excitement and fearing the supernatural. He thought of the commandant, corrupt and greedy, vulnerable to suggestion from the spirit world if it was properly approached. And he thought of himself, a stage magician turned prisoner of war, holding skills no other captive in this god-forsaken camp possessed. The conventional wisdom said escape from Yozgad was impossible. Jones agreed. Conventional escape was suicide, but an unconventional escape, one that played on the captors' deepest fears and beliefs, one that made their imprisonment seem more dangerous to the Turks than their release, that might work. That had to work, because the only other option was to surrender to despair, and Jones had already surrendered once at Cut. He would not do it again. The performance was about to begin. Chapter 2. The Prison of the Mind. Yozgad was not a place of systematic physical brutality like some camps, but of soul-crushing monotony. The days bled together, measured only by meagre rations of bread and soup, twice daily roll calls, and infrequent mail. The camp's commandant, Kazim Bey, was more concerned with his own comfort than with elaborate security. The guards, mostly local reservists, were poorly educated and deeply superstitious. Within this environment of profound boredom and cultural credulity, Jones saw his opportunity. He watched the camp's sycophantic interpreter, nicknamed the Pimple, dabble in spiritualism to curry favor with the commandant. Jones realized that the key to unlocking Yozgad wasn't a physical key, but a psychological one. He needed a meticulous and trustworthy partner to help build and maintain an elaborate deception. He found that man in C.W. Hill, an Australian Royal Flying Corps pilot whose down-to-earth skepticism provided the perfect anchor for Jones's audacious otherworldly scheme. The morning roll call on Jones's fourth day established the rhythm that would govern every waking hour. Guards shouted numbers in Turkish while prisoners stood in rough formation outside their prison, a converted Armenian house. Kazim Bey would appear on the second-floor balcony in his elaborate uniform, surveying the assembled British officers with the bored expression of a man performing an unwanted duty. The Pimple scurried beside him, translating pronouncements about camp regulations. Jones counted 23 British officers, most captured during the disastrous Kut al-Amara siege in Mesopotamia. The roll call lasted 40 minutes, not for verification, but because Kazim Bey enjoyed the theatre of command. When finally dismissed, the prisoners shuffled back inside, their daily obligation to Turkish authority fulfilled until evening. The afternoon work detail revealed more about Yozgad's peculiar nature. Jones joined 8 other officers assigned to repair the camp's dilapidated stone walls. The guards overseeing the work, older reserve infantry, treated their duties with casual indifference. One guard, a gap-toothed farmer named Osman, spent most of his time smoking and telling stories to his companion about jinn that supposedly haunted the nearby hills. Jones mixed mortar and stacked stones, listening to the superstitious conversations. The guards believed in spirits with the same certainty they believed in Allah. They wore amulets against evil eyes and refused to work after dark for fear of supernatural encounters. Jones noticed Osman making protective gestures whenever conversation turned to the occult, tracing signs in the air. The wall repair served no real security purpose. Most sections they rebuilt had crumbled from age, not escape attempts. The work existed solely to occupy prisoners and maintain the appearance of military discipline. By the third week, Jones had mapped the camp's invisible architecture of boredom. Breakfast arrived at 7, always the same watery soup and black bread that tasted of sawdust. Morning hours stretched empty until noon roll call. Afternoons brought work details or enforced idleness, Depending on the guards' moods, evening roll call occurred at 5, followed by another meagre meal and the long descent into night. The physical deterioration happened slowly enough that each man pretended not to notice. Jones's uniform hung looser, his ribs becoming visible. The constant hunger gnawed at concentration, making simple tasks feel monumental. Other prisoners showed similar decline. Major Matthews developed a hacking cough that echoed through the dormitory at night, and Lieutenant Stoker's gums bled from scurvy. The camp doctor, a Turkish physician who visited weekly, distributed aspirin and sympathy in equal, inadequate measures. The other prisoners revealed themselves through small actions and survival strategies. Matthews, the senior British officer, maintained rigid military bearing despite his deteriorating health, acting as though Yozgad were an inconvenient posting rather than a prison. His insistence on proper dress and military courtesy became its own form of resistance. Doc O'Farrell, the camp's senior medical officer, had procured a battered medical textbook and spent hours reviewing treatments he had no supplies to administer. He taught Jones basic field medicine during quiet afternoons, explaining how to set bones and treat wounds using only available materials. The knowledge felt academic, but O'Farrell insisted that preparation distinguished professionals from amateurs. Then there was Price, a lieutenant who had begun talking to himself. Price's conversations with invisible companions grew longer each day, and the other prisoners watched his decline, uneasily recognizing that madness lurked as close as the next sunrise for any of them. The guards operated on patterns so predictable they were almost scheduled. The morning shift arrived at 6, groggy and resentful. They counted prisoners perfunctorily, more concerned with their breakfast than with accuracy. The afternoon guards were marginally more attentive, but vanished between 3 and 4 to take tea in the commandant's quarters. Evening sentries took their posts at 5, but frequently retreated to the warmth of their barracks after dark, rather than patrolling the freezing Anatolian night. Osman and his fellow reservists viewed guard duty as tedious labor, not sacred responsibility. They enforced rules inconsistently, sometimes harassing prisoners over minor infractions, other times ignoring blatant violations if intervention required effort. The camp's security relied entirely on geography and circumstance, not vigilance. Yozgad sat in central Anatolia, hundreds of miles from any Allied territory. Escape seemed pointless when recapture or death in the wilderness appeared inevitable. Death arrived on Jones's 32nd day, not dramatically, but with bureaucratic finality. Lieutenant Chambers, who had seemed healthy at morning roll call, collapsed during the afternoon work detail. Doc O'Farrell rushed to him, but Chambers was already gone, his heart stopped by malnutrition and undiagnosed disease. The Turkish authorities removed the body with efficient disinterest, and Kazim Bey sent official condolences, translated by the Pimple in his obsequious manner. The remaining prisoners held a brief memorial service, then returned to their routines. Dwelling on death served no purpose. Jones found himself unmoved, not from callousness, but from emotional exhaustion. He had stopped counting days, stopped imagining rescue. He existed in an eternal present where yesterday and tomorrow held no meaning. The grinding had succeeded where brutality might have failed, wearing away hope until escape felt like a fantasy. The shift came during the 6th week, as patient observation sharpened into recognition. Jones sat in the common room watching the Pimple conduct a ridiculous séance for Kazim Bey's entertainment. The interpreter had spread out candles and a makeshift Ouija board. He intoned gibberish he claimed was ancient mystical language, while Kazim Bey and 2 Turkish officers watched with rapt attention. The fraud was transparent, yet the Turks believed it absolutely. They gasped when the Pimple's spirits predicted a German victory, and nodded solemnly when ghostly voices proclaimed Kazim Bey's greatness. The commandant rewarded the Pimple with extra rations for his supernatural services. Watching this performance, Jones understood something crucial about Yozgad. The camp's weakness was not physical, but psychological. These men were profoundly, almost childishly superstitious. They believed in magic more readily than in discipline. Their faith in the supernatural exceeded their commitment to security. Jones began seeing the camp differently. The guards were not obstacles to overcome through force, but believers waiting to be convinced. Kazim Bey was not a jailer to defeat, but an audience to manipulate. The Pimple's success demonstrated that authority at Yozgad responded to theatre and mysticism, not military protocol. During work details, Jones listened more carefully to the guards' stories. He noted which spirits they feared, which rituals they performed, and which signs they interpreted as omens. Osman believed eagles carried messages from the dead. Another guard wore 3 separate amulets his mother had warned him about. They spoke of spirit worlds and divine interventions with the same certainty British soldiers discussed football scores. For them, supernatural forces were active participants in daily life, not abstract theological concepts. The possibility took shape slowly, like a photograph developing. Jones could not tunnel under Yozgad's walls, overpower guards, or forge documents, but he could potentially convince superstitious men that supernatural forces demanded his release. The idea seemed absurd and too theatrical at first, yet he had watched the Pimple's crude deceptions gain him comfort. The interpreter possessed no special charisma, just a willingness to exploit his audience's credulity. Jones had education, imagination, and desperate motivation that the Pimple lacked. If that fool could manipulate Kazim Bey with elementary tricks, what could someone with genuine intelligence accomplish using the same methods? The question transformed Yozgad from an inescapable prison into a stage where the right performance might unlock doors that force could never breach. Jones needed an accomplice, someone who could maintain deception under sustained scrutiny. He studied his fellow prisoners with new purpose, evaluating them as potential co-conspirators. Matthews was too rigid, too committed to military propriety for such fraud. O'Farrell was too honest to sustain systematic deception. Price was too broken. Most others were too demoralized, focused on simply surviving, to commit to a long-term stratagem requiring patience and precision. Jones nearly abandoned the idea until he noticed C.W. Hill, the Australian Flying Corps pilot who occupied a corner bunk and rarely spoke unless necessary. Hill was different. The Australian possessed a watchful skepticism that seemed immune to both despair and false hope. He performed his camp duties without complaint, but also without the defeated resignation of most prisoners. He read voraciously, maintaining concentration despite malnutrition, and played chess with a methodical thoroughness suggesting a disciplined mind. Most importantly, Hill watched the Pimple's séances with barely concealed contempt. A skeptic was exactly what Jones needed, someone whose natural disbelief would provide a perfect counterbalance to Jones's own theatrical inclinations. A true believer might compromise the deception through excessive enthusiasm, but a skeptic would maintain the rigorous discipline necessary to sustain fraud over months. Jones approached Hill casually one afternoon as they sat in the courtyard during the guards' tea break. He commented on the effectiveness of the Pimple's obvious theatrics. Hill snorted, replying that only fools believed such nonsense. Jones agreed, then asked quietly if Hill had noticed that the fools included everyone who controlled their fate. The Australian's expression changed, his skepticism sharpening into interest. Jones explained his observation about the guards' superstition and Kazim Bey's credulity. He suggested, hypothetically, that someone with sufficient nerve could exploit that weakness, not through crude imitation, but through sophisticated psychological manipulation that would make spiritualism seem like the prisoner's idea. Hill listened without interruption, his silence indicating consideration. Finally, the Australian asked what Jones had in mind. Jones smiled. beginning to explain how two supposedly haunted British officers might convince their captors that supernatural forces demanded their transfer to Constantinople for specialized treatment. From Constantinople, escape was merely a matter of timing. The courtyard's shadows lengthened as Jones outlined his audacious plan. Hill asked pointed questions about logistics, timing, and risks. The Australian skepticism remained, but it now served a constructive purpose, identifying weaknesses in the scheme that required refinement. They spoke in low voices, two prisoners discussing nothing more suspicious than camp gossip to any casual observer. But in that conversation, the prison of the mind that Yozgad represented began transforming. The bars remained identical, the guards conducted the same routines, and the monotony continued unchanged. Yet everything had shifted. Jones and Hill now possessed what they had lacked since capture, a concrete reason to believe that intelligence and audacity might accomplish what force could never achieve. Yozgad was about to become the stage for the most elaborate psychological escape attempt of the Great War, a deception so intricate that decades later people would struggle to believe it had actually succeeded. Chapter 3. A Ghost is Born. The breaking point for Jones wasn't violence, but the creeping horror of indefinite stagnation. August 1917, 29 months in Yozgad. He watched Lieutenant Matthews, a pre-war solicitor, talking to people who weren't there, tears streaming down his face. Captain Harrison spent hours arranging pebbles into patterns only he understood. The Turkish guards laughed. Jones felt his own mind fray. The urge to surrender to madness, to escape the purposeless waiting. Then the idea struck with crystalline clarity. What if madness itself could be weaponized? He saw men losing their minds for real and decided the only way out was to lose his own purpose. The realization hit him with physical force. The Turks feared genuine insanity. They sent the truly broken to Constantinople for medical evaluation, to hospitals far from Yozgad. That path led closer to the coast, to neutral territory, to everything that mattered. But it couldn't be obvious. It had to be gradual, documented, and so convincing that even fellow prisoners would believe it. Jones found Hill that afternoon, pulling him into the shimmering August heat of their room. As Jones explained, Hill's eyes widened, then narrowed in calculation. They both understood. This was either brilliant or suicidal, possibly both. He and Hill constructed a crude Ouija board from a salvaged packing crate and an inverted glass tumbler, working after lights out by a smuggled candle stub. The board was roughly 18 inches square, its letters painstakingly carved with the tip of a spoon Jones had sharpened for weeks. He painted the letters with boot polish and water, creating uneven, manic-looking characters. The finished object looked exactly as intended, shabby, obsessive, and slightly unhinged. They began holding fake séances, initially to amuse their fellow officers. The first session was August 15th. 6 prisoners crowded into the sweltering room, fingertips touching the glass as Jones asked questions in a theatrical whisper. The glass moved because Jones and Hill subtly pushed it. They invented the Spook, a ghostly entity they claimed was the spirit of a British officer killed at Kut. Jones had researched the role, remembering stories from pre-war spiritualists. The key was making others believe first, so the Turks would follow. When Captain Morrison asked about his wife, the Spook spelled out a message so vague it could mean anything. Morrison's eyes filled with tears. He believed. Jones felt a mixture of guilt and satisfaction. Word of their activities was deliberately allowed to reach the Pimple, the interpreter, who reported it to the intrigued Commandant Kiazim Bey. Jones made sure of it, speaking loudly of the séances in the courtyard and leaving the Ouija board partially visible during inspections. Within days, the Pimple appeared at their door, his curiosity barely concealed. Jones played his part perfectly, offering reluctant confirmations with the bearing of a man who half believed his own deception. The Pimple's skepticism visibly wavered. 24 hours later, Kazim Bey himself requested a demonstration. This was the crucial moment. They set up the board while the commandant, the pimple, and 2 guards watched from the doorway. Jones had spent the day gathering intelligence, which he now deployed ruthlessly. The glass moved. The spook spelled out trivial secrets the British prisoners shouldn't have known, that one guard had lost money gambling, that the pimple had argued with his brother. Jones, using techniques of cold reading learned from a performer in London, preyed on their reactions. He watched the pimple's eyes widen at the mention of his brother. A tiny flinch confirmed the guess. Jones pressed, having the spook elaborate with careful vagueness that allowed the pimple to fill in the details himself. The guard who'd lost money gasped. Jones maintained his focused, trance-like expression, appearing as surprised as anyone. Hill played his part perfectly, asking questions with a growing, seemingly genuine enthusiasm. The room felt electric. Their credibility grew. Kazim Bey returned 3 times in the next week, bringing different officers to test the spook. Jones spent every waking moment gathering intelligence. He befriended the Armenian cook to learn guard gossip. He watched facial expressions during sessions to calibrate future revelations. The spook began making minor verifiable predictions which Jones could influence or guess: when prisoners would be transferred based on orders he'd glimpsed, what the next meal would contain from overheard kitchen talk. Each correct prediction deepened the Turks' fascination and fear. Guards started avoiding eye contact with Jones, believing something supernatural was occurring. The deception was now a calculated psychological operation. To convince their captors they were conduits to the supernatural, their sanity had to appear to be fraying under the strain. This was the critical element. Jones began a physical deterioration. He stopped shaving, developed a slight tremor in his hands, and would start mid-conversation, as if hearing unheard voices. Hill matched his performance, growing increasingly obsessed with the board. They created a shared delusion visible to everyone, and soon the camp doctor, a Turkish physician named Osman, began observing them. Jones escalated deliberately, producing pages of automatic messages dictated by the spook. The text, a mix of coherent warnings and gibberish, was composed in a shaky hand. He showed them to the pimple, claiming no memory of writing them. As planned, they were taken to Kazim Bey, creating the official record of deteriorating mental health that Jones so desperately needed. The physical toll of the performance was real. Maintaining the deception required constant vigilance. Jones genuinely lost weight, the stress burning through his meager rations, and his hands developed an actual tremor from exhaustion. The line between performance and reality blurred. Hill noticed, warning Jones they were getting in too deep, but they had crossed a threshold. There was no turning back. By early September, the camp's dynamic had shifted. Guards and even the pimple requested readings about their futures. Jones and Hill were no longer just prisoners. In Turkish eyes, they were cursed men. Jones catalogued every advantage. Guards gave them more freedom, nervous about restricting men who might channel supernatural vengeance. Room inspections became cursory. Male censorship relaxed. He absorbed it all, filing away every scrap of intelligence on camp vulnerabilities. The plan clarified. They would convince the Turks their supernatural obsession required transfer to Constantinople for treatment. Closer to the coast and neutral embassies, escape possibilities would multiply. But the madness had to be specific, dangerous enough to require removal, but not so violent they'd be shot. They were threading an impossibly narrow needle where one mistake meant execution. Their commitment was absolute. They had gone too far to stop. The Turkish command structure knew about the spook, and reports had reached Constantinople. Their madness was documented and official. The only way out was deeper into the deception, closer to the edge where authority couldn't distinguish performance from reality. Hill asked him one night, after another exhausting session, "How far are we prepared to take this?" Jones didn't hesitate. All the way to Constantinople. all the way to the madhouse, if that gets us closer to freedom. We've built something they can't ignore. Now we make them act on it. September gave way to October. The sessions grew more bizarre, with automatic drawing and strange symbols mixing with accurate intelligence. Dr. Osman examined Jones twice, noting symptoms of nervous exhaustion and possible dissociative episodes in his official reports. The medical documentation was accumulating. The other prisoners watched with mixed fear and hope. Some believed they'd lost their minds, while sharper observers began to understand this was an escape by strategic insanity. Jones let the ambiguity fester. Only the Turkish opinions mattered. By late October, 3 months in, Jones existed in a state of hyper-awareness and genuine dissociation. He had become the role so completely that the spook had taken on a life of its own in his mind. This total commitment was necessary. The first official recommendation for medical transfer came on October the 28th. Dr. Osman submitted paperwork to Kazim Bey requesting Jones and Hill be evaluated by specialists in Constantinople. The commandant hesitated, suspicious but also genuinely concerned. The spook, through Jones, then predicted this very hesitation and offered guidance so accurate it spooked even the pimple. That sealed it. Within 48 hours, Constantinople confirmed. The 2 British officers would be transferred for psychiatric evaluation within the month. Jones felt the first genuine stirring of hope in 30 months. The plan was working. Madness had become transportation. The spook was their ticket beyond Yozgad. Everything now depended on maintaining the deception through the transfer and evaluation. What happened in Constantinople remained uncertain, but after 29 months of stagnation, simply moving felt like victory. The spook had one more prediction to make. 3 days before their scheduled transfer, Jones delivered it, his voice distant, his hands trembling genuinely from exhaustion and the stress of their desperate gamble. He and Hill would see England again. The pimple wrote it down. The guards exchanged nervous glances. Kazim Bey said nothing, but ordered increased documentation of all future sessions until departure. It was perfect. The impossible escape through madness had become possible through absolute commitment to the insane. Chapter 4. The Treasure and the Madness. The plan entered its audacious final phase. Guided by Jones, the Ouija board revealed clues to a fictitious hoard of buried treasure hidden near the camp generations ago. This masterstroke shifted their captors' motivation from suspicion to greed. The commandant, Kazim Bey, was hooked, taking Jones and Hill on guarded treasure-hunting expeditions to locations dictated by the spook. To solidify the hoax, they manufactured clues, planting antique coins for the commandant to discover. Simultaneously, their public behavior grew increasingly bizarre. Jones held loud conversations with thin air, while Hill adopted the persona of a silent, devoted acolyte. They neglected their hygiene and feigned terrifying hallucinations. To their captors, they were not escapees, but 2 Englishmen descending into a madness that might coincidentally make Kazim Bey a very rich man. The real objective was never the treasure. It was a medical file stamped insane. The scheme's beauty lay in exploiting human weakness. Every captor wanted something. The guards, entertainment; Kazim Bey, wealth; the camp doctor, fascinating case studies. Jones and Hill would give them all what they craved. In return, they would receive what no tunnel or wire cutter could provide: official documentation declaring them unfit for captivity. The Turkish authorities would send certified madmen to Constantinople for evaluation and probable repatriation. The door would open not through force, but through performance, but the performance required precision. One slip, one moment of clarity caught by suspicious eyes, and the entire elaborate construction would collapse. Jones took the lead as the primary spiritualist, the man through whom the spook spoke. Hill became his devoted follower, the rational officer slowly corrupted by supernatural obsession. They needed witnesses to their descent, believers who would testify to the transformation. That meant recruiting carefully selected fellow prisoners into the inner circle of the hoax. Matthews, a level-headed POW with a medical background, came first. His opinion held weight. Jones approached him during evening roll call, his voice low beneath the count. "Need you to believe I'm going mad." Publicly. Matthews's eyes flickered with understanding. He had watched men break under captivity. 3 days later, he began expressing concern to other prisoners about Jones's deteriorating mental state. One ally was secured. Price, the camp wit, joined next. His mockery would be useful, spreading word of Jones's madness faster than any rumor. The risk was that Price loved an audience. Could he keep the core deception secret while performing public skepticism? Jones gambled on vanity, telling him the truth but swearing him to silence, making him part of the greatest joke ever played on their captors. Price grinned. "I'll make them believe you've lost every marble." They now had 2 allies. They needed the doctor convinced most of all, but camp physician Mazhar Osman was no fool. Trained in European medical schools, he knew psychiatric symptoms from genuine pathology. Convincing him required symptoms that matched textbook cases of spiritualist obsession leading to a psychotic break. Jones spent evenings studying remembered psychology texts, constructing a believable descent. Auditory hallucinations, visual disturbances, paranoid fixations, and religious mania. Each symptom had to build on the last, a progressive deterioration witnessed by multiple sources. The treasure mythology gave them cover. The spook, speaking through the Ouija board during sessions Kazim Bey now attended eagerly, described an Armenian merchant who had buried gold coins and jeweled artifacts near Yozgad in 1820 while fleeing Ottoman persecution. The treasure supposedly lay in 3 caches, each location revealed through cryptic clues requiring interpretation. Jones ensured the clues were just obscure enough to need multiple expeditions, yet clear enough to seem legitimate. The first expedition came on a cold morning in March 1918. Kazim Bey, personally supervised as guards, escorted Jones and Hill beyond the camp perimeter to a rocky hillside 2 miles distant. The freedom of movement, even under guard, was intoxicating. Jones forced himself to focus. He had planted the first coin 3 days earlier during a wood-gathering detail, slipping it under a distinctive rock formation. Now, he let the spook guide them to it through dramatic trance-channeling. When the ancient coin emerged from beneath the stone, Kazim Bey's hands trembled as he lifted it. Greed had taken root. Back in camp, Jones escalated the performance. That evening, he stood in the barracks yard arguing with empty air, his voice rising. "I don't care what you say. The 3rd cache isn't where you claim." Prisoners stared. Guards watched with uneasy fascination. Jones spun, addressing a guard in fractured Turkish. "Tell the spirit he's wrong about the monastery ruins." The guard backed away. Hill stood nearby, silent and watchful, the concerned friend observing his companion's decline. 3 days later came a second expedition, this time to a dry streambed. Jones had acquired the next coin through careful trade, giving up his tobacco ration to a guard who collected Ottoman-era currency. He had aged it with acid from the camp's medical supplies, creating a convincing patina. Hill planted it during the search, while Jones distracted Kazim Bey with elaborate divining rituals. The commandant found the coin himself, wedged between rocks exactly where the spook had indicated. His skepticism crumbled. He now believed. The preparations grew more complex. Jones needed symptoms to worsen visibly. He stopped bathing. He refused certain foods, claiming the spook forbade them, and began waking at night, screaming about visions. Hill matched the descent with quieter symptoms: withdrawal from others, obsessive note-taking, and speaking only when the spook permitted. Matthews observed everything, sharing concerned reports with the camp doctor. Price made jokes that spread through the POW population, cementing the narrative. Then came the close call that nearly destroyed everything. A Turkish officer visiting from Constantinople, Colonel Marufi, attended one of the séances. Marufi watched Jones channel the spook with narrow, calculating eyes. When Kazım Bey enthusiastically described the treasure discoveries, Marufi asked pointed questions. How did Jones know Ottoman history? Why did an English pilot suddenly demonstrate knowledge of Armenian merchant routes? His suspicion was palpable. Jones felt cold sweat against his skin beneath the officer's scrutiny. That night, Jones lay awake. If Marufi reported this as an escape plot, they would face solitary confinement or worse. The Turks shot prisoners who attempted escape. Everything depended on Kazım Bey's greed overwhelming Marufi's doubt. Jones had to make the madness more convincing, had to descend so far into apparent psychosis that the treasure hunt would seem secondary to the medical emergency unfolding. The next morning, Jones stopped speaking Turkish and English. For 3 days, he communicated only through Hill, who claimed Jones now heard all language filtered through the spook's voice and couldn't process human speech without his interpreter. Guards found him sitting motionless for hours, his eyes tracking movement no one else could see. He carved meaningless symbols into the barracks walls, suggesting obsessive religious mania. When the doctor examined him, Jones's pupils were dilated from belladonna he had obtained from the camp pharmacy. His pulse raced, his hands shook. Dr. Mazhar Osman made detailed notes. Jones watched the physician's face, reading the diagnosis forming behind his professional detachment. Schizophrenic break, a spiritualist obsession triggering a psychotic episode. The doctor questioned Hill about the progression. Hill described it perfectly. Gradual onset following the séances, acceleration after the first treasure discovery, and now complete separation from reality. He played the worried companion beautifully, a rational man trying to help his friend while being pulled into the delusion himself. Kazım Bey, however, wanted to continue the treasure hunts. The third and largest cache remained unfound. But the doctor insisted Jones was too unstable for expeditions. They compromised. Hill would accompany the commandant while Jones channeled the spook from the camp, communicating locations through trance states. It worked perfectly. Hill could now plant evidence without Jones present, making the discoveries seem even more supernaturally guided. Over the next 6 weeks, they fleshed out the treasure mythology. Each expedition yielded small finds, coins, jewelry fragments, pottery shards. Nothing valuable enough to fully satisfy Kazım Bey's greed, but everything authentic enough to keep him believing. Jones and Hill had spent their meager funds and traded every possession of value to acquire these props. The performance consumed everything. Jones's symptoms worsened on schedule. Claiming the spook commanded him to fast, he dropped a dangerous amount of weight from his already emaciated frame. He saw demons in shadows, angels in lamplight, and prophetic visions in the yard's dust patterns. Hill descended more subtly, his madness the quiet kind, obsessive recording of the spook's messages, refusing to acknowledge any reality that contradicted the spirit's commands, and showing complete emotional dependence on Jones. The other prisoners watched with mixed reactions. Some believed the madness was genuine, others suspected a performance but couldn't discern its purpose. A few guessed at an escape plan but kept silent, hoping it might create opportunities. For the guards it was entertaining, then disturbing, and finally routine. 2 crazy Englishmen talking to ghosts became just another feature of camp life. By May 1918, Dr. Mazhar Osman completed his evaluation. He diagnosed Jones with an acute psychotic disorder triggered by spiritualist practices and exacerbated by captivity. Hill showed symptoms of folie à deux, a shared psychotic disorder induced by his close association with Jones. The doctor's report recommended immediate transfer to Constantinople for specialized psychiatric care and probable repatriation on medical grounds. 2 officers so severely mentally compromised posed no military threat and represented a humanitarian concern under international conventions. Reading those words in the report, which Kiazim Bey showed him proudly, Jones felt his heart race with something other than feigned symptoms. The plan was working. The impossible was becoming real. But the final phase remained, convincing a medical board in Constantinople that the madness was too deep for recovery in captivity. That performance would occur far from Yozgad, beyond the familiar stage where they had practiced every gesture. New doctors would examine them with fresh, skeptical eyes. The margin for error would shrink to nothing. The order came on June the 12th. Jones and Hill would leave for Constantinople in 3 days. Kiazim Bey protested, still believing the main treasure remained unfound, but military authority overruled him. Jones spent those final days cementing the performance. He stopped sleeping, maintaining the wide-eyed stare of a man plagued by hallucinations. Hill grew quieter, speaking only in whispers and flinching at sudden movements. On the morning of departure, Jones stood in the Yozgad prison yard for the last time. Other prisoners watched silently. He had endured 17 months in this camp, and now he was leaving through sheer theatrical audacity. The insanity that would carry him through the gates had become so practiced that he sometimes wondered where the performance ended and a genuine fracture began. Hill stood beside him, silent and watchful as always. They had rehearsed everything except this moment of actually leaving. The wagon waited. Guards approached. It was time to commit completely, to maintain the madness through every checkpoint until doctors declared them too broken to cage. Jones climbed into the wagon, muttering to invisible spirits, Hill following like a shadow. The gates of Yozgad opened. Behind them, Kiazim Bey watched his treasure hunters depart, still half believing they had channeled supernatural forces. Ahead lay Constantinople, medical boards, and the final desperate performance. Jones felt the rough wood of the wagon bed beneath him, felt the sun, the first warmth beyond wire in months. Guards rode alongside, rifles ready, watching two madmen travel toward freedom or exposure. The wagon rolled forward, the gates closed, Yozgad disappeared, and with it their familiar stage. Now came the true test, convincing strangers the insanity was incurable, that repatriation was the only option. The escape had begun, not with tunnels or wire cutters, but with a Ouija board and a fictional treasure. It would continue through a performance sustained against every instinct for sanity, a bid for survival through the appearance of complete psychological collapse. Chapter 5. The Medical Examination. The camp doctor began to notice the duo's deteriorating state. This was not a discovery of their plan, but its intended consequence. Jones and Hill were called for medical evaluation, the first crucial test of their long-term performance. Facing Turkish doctors, they had to be utterly convincing. Jones feigned extreme paranoia, claiming the spook was tormenting him, while Hill played the part of a catatonic, loyal follower who only responded to Jones. Their act was so thorough that the local doctors, lacking sophisticated psychiatric knowledge, were baffled and concerned. Kiazim Bey, still hoping for his treasure, was reluctant to let them go, but the medical reports could not be ignored. Word was sent up the chain of command. The two prisoners were deemed a medical liability. An order came through. Transport Lieutenants Jones and Hill to Haydar Pasha Hospital in Constantinople for further evaluation by a board of senior Turkish and neutral doctors for potential medical repatriation. Jones sits rigid in the examination chair, his knuckles white where he grips the wooden arms. The Turkish doctor, a stout man with weary eyes, circles him slowly, notepad in hand. Every muscle in Jones's body screams to relax, to break character, to acknowledge the absurdity of what he is doing. He does not. His eyes track invisible movements across the ceiling, following phantom spiders spinning webs of intrigue in the dusty plaster. His fingers twitch against his thighs in patterns only he can see. The doctor asks a question in broken English, the words hanging in the stale air. Jones does not respond. He tilts his head as if listening to voices no one else hears. The spook is speaking. The spook is always speaking now. Jones has lived with this invisible tormentor for months, has made it real through sheer repetition, has convinced himself on some terrible level that it exists. He mutters under his breath, fragmented words, warnings, pleas to leave him alone. The doctor leans closer, his breath smelling faintly of tobacco and coffee. Jones recoils violently, a guttural cry escaping his lips as he nearly topples the chair. He points at the corner of the room where nothing stands. His hand shakes. This is not pretense anymore. This is method transformed into madness through sustained performance. The line between acting and reality has blurred until Jones himself cannot always find it. Hill stands in the corner. He does not sit when told. He does not acknowledge the doctor's presence. His eyes remain fixed on Jones with the devotion of a disciple watching a prophet. When the doctor approaches him, Hill does not react. When questions come, silence answers. The doctor waves a hand before Hill's face. Nothing. Hill exists in a state of complete dissociation from everything except Jones. This, too, has become real through months of practice. Hill has trained himself to see nothing, hear nothing, respond to nothing except Jones's voice. It is a self-induced trance state born from repetition and desperate need. The doctor tries Turkish, then German, then French. Hill's expression never changes. His breathing remains shallow and even, his posture rigid as a statue. Only when Jones speaks, barely a whisper of supposed instruction from the spook, does Hill move. He takes 2 steps forward. The exactness of the response unnerves the doctor more than the catatonia itself. This is not ordinary shell shock. This is something the provincial physician has never encountered. The examination continues for 90 minutes. Jones provides a masterclass in sustained psychosis. He argues with empty air. He weeps at invisible torments. He describes in precise detail the spook's demands regarding the treasure at Yozgad, the codes, the punishments for disobedience. Every word is calculated, yet delivered with the conviction of genuine delusion. The doctor scribbles notes rapidly. Hill maintains his frozen devotion, moving only when Jones indicates, speaking only single-word responses in a monotone that suggests complete psychological dependence. The performance is so complete, so thoroughly embodied, that the doctor's skepticism crumbles. These are not malingerers. These are men whose minds have fractured under captivity's weight. The doctor has seen shell shock before. He has seen depression, anxiety, even occasional hysteria. But this coordinated madness, this folie à deux where one man's delusion has consumed another's will entirely, this is beyond his experience and his competence. The doctor exits to consult with the camp commandant. Through the closed door, Jones and Hill maintain their roles. They do not break character. They cannot afford even a moment's lapse. Other prisoners have tried to fake illness, have exaggerated wounds, have feigned blindness or deafness. All have been caught. The Turkish doctors are not fools. They have methods for detecting deception, techniques refined through years of examining prisoners desperate to escape. Jones and Hill have studied these methods, have anticipated every test, have prepared responses that pass scrutiny because they are not simple fakery but complete psychological transformation. They have made themselves actually ill through starvation and stress. They have made their madness believable because they have lived it so thoroughly that fragments have become genuine. This is survival through self-destruction, escape through calculated insanity, freedom pursued at the cost of their own minds. While Jones and Hill waited in the examination room, the camp administration erupted into urgent debate. The doctor's report lands on Kiazim Bey's desk like a grenade. The commandant reads it twice, his face darkening with each pass. 2 British officers, both deemed severely mentally unstable, both requiring immediate transfer to specialized care in Constantinople. The timing is catastrophic. The treasure hunt has consumed months of effort. Jones's supposed connection to the Spook has promised riches that would secure Kiazim Bey's future, perhaps even earn him promotion and recognition. Now these same officers are being declared unfit for continued detention at Yozgad. The commandant summons his senior staff. The meeting is tense. The doctor stands firm on his diagnosis. These men need psychiatric evaluation by specialists. Their continued presence at Yozgad is both a humanitarian concern and a practical liability. If they deteriorate further, if one commits suicide or completely breaks down, the responsibility falls on the camp administration. The Ottoman Empire is still bound by certain conventions regarding prisoner treatment, and documented madness requires appropriate response. Kiazim Bey resists. He argues Jones is functional enough to continue the spiritual communications. He suggests the treasure hunt is actually helping Jones's mental state by giving him purpose. The doctor is unimpressed. He points to Jones's weight loss, his tremors, his increasingly disturbed behavior visible to everyone in the camp. He notes Hill's complete dependence, his catatonic episodes, his withdrawal from all normal interaction. These are not conditions that improve under current circumstances. They require hospitalization. The camp's senior Turkish officers exchange glances. Several have grown skeptical of the treasure hunt. They have watched Kiazim Bey become increasingly obsessed, have seen resources diverted to séances and excavations that yield nothing. The doctor's report provides an excuse to end the farce. If the British officers are genuinely mad, then their spiritual communications are worthless. The treasure is fantasy. The entire operation has been chasing delusions. The argument continues for 3 hours. Telegrams are drafted to Constantinople. Kiazim Bey makes increasingly desperate cases for keeping Jones and Hill at Yozgad. He suggests they are malingering, that their madness is performance designed to escape. The doctor challenges him. Prove it. How does one prove madness is false when the subjects maintain it so completely? How does one test for deception when the behavior is consistent across months of observation? Kiazim Bey has no answer. The camp's other doctors are consulted. They review Jones and Hill, conduct brief additional examinations, and concur with the original assessment. Both men require specialized evaluation and likely repatriation on medical grounds. The commandant's resistance crumbles under the weight of unified medical opinion and his own officers' skepticism. The order is given. Prepare transport for Lieutenants Jones and Hill to Haydar Pasha Hospital in Constantinople. They will appear before a medical board composed of senior Turkish military doctors and neutral physicians who will determine their fitness for continued detention or their eligibility for medical repatriation to Britain. For Jones and Hill, confined again to their quarters after the examination, the notification arrives like deliverance and terror combined. They have succeeded beyond the immediate goal. They have convinced the camp doctors. They have forced Kiazim Bey's hand despite his obvious reluctance. But now comes the far more dangerous phase. Constantinople means senior doctors with more training, more experience, more sophisticated understanding of psychiatric conditions. It means neutral physicians from countries like Spain or Sweden who might have studied modern psychology, who might recognize performance no matter how skilled. The medical board at Haydar Pasha has examined hundreds of British prisoners claiming various ailments. They have developed keen eyes for malingering. They have sent dozens of fakers back to their camps with notations in their files that ensure harsher treatment. Jones and Hill have perhaps won the first battle only to face a war they cannot win. Jones paces their quarters in the gathering darkness. The Spook must accompany them to Constantinople. The madness must deepen, not lighten. Any sign of improvement, any hint that removal from Yozgad's stresses has restored their mental health, and the board will declare them fit for return. They must appear to deteriorate further during transport. They must convince doctors who have seen every trick, every performance, every desperate attempt at deception that British prisoners can devise. Hill sits motionless, already practicing the deeper catatonia he will need. He has trained himself to maintain the state for hours now. In Constantinople, it may need to be days. His mind rehearses the blankness, the absolute refusal to acknowledge reality except through Jones's mediation. It is a form of meditation in reverse, a cultivation of absence rather than presence. The magnitude of what they have done begins to fully settle on them. They have starved themselves to the edge of genuine malnutrition. They have induced actual psychological stress through months of sustained performance. They have isolated themselves from every normal human comfort and connection. All of this has been voluntary, calculated, pursued with the understanding that the only path to freedom lies through convincing medical repatriation. But the plan's success depends on factors beyond their control. They need the Constantinople board to believe them. They need the political situation to favor repatriation of mentally unfit prisoners. They need the Ottoman authorities to value removing liabilities more than retaining questionable captives. They need luck. Jones stops pacing. He looks at Hill in the darkness. Neither man speaks. They have barely spoken, except in character, for months. The trust between them is absolute and terrible. Each has placed his life and sanity in the other's commitment to the performance. If either breaks, both are lost. If Hill cracks and reveals the deception, Jones faces punishment and permanent marking as a fraud. If Jones cannot maintain the spook delusion under expert scrutiny, Hill's catatonia becomes obviously false. They are bound together in a conspiracy so intimate and demanding that it has erased their former selves. They are no longer quite the men who arrived at Yozgad. They are something they have created through month after month of deliberate madness. The transport order specifies departure in 4 days, 4 more days to prepare, to deepen the performance, to commit themselves beyond any remaining point of return. 4 days to convince the remaining Yozgad prisoners that their condition is deteriorating, to show symptoms that will be reported to Constantinople before they even arrive. 4 days to prepare for the most dangerous medical examination of their lives, where expert doctors will probe for exactly the kind of deception they are perpetrating. Jones begins to shake. Not performance now, genuine fear, the enormity of the gamble overwhelming him. Hill rises and crosses to him, places a hand on his shoulder, the first real human contact between them in weeks. They stand together in the darkness of the Yozgad barracks, 2 men who have chosen to destroy themselves psychologically in the desperate hope of reconstructing their lives in freedom. The madness they have cultivated as tool has become environment. They swim in it now. They breathe it. The only direction is forward, deeper into the performance, until doctors in Constantinople either believe completely and grant repatriation or see through the act and condemn them to consequences neither wishes to imagine. There is no middle ground. There is no retreat. There is only the medical board waiting in Constantinople, and the absolute requirement that Jones and Hill convince them beyond all doubt that 2 British officers have been driven irreparably insane by the spook of Yozgad. Chapter 6. The Final Performance. The escape's climax was not a desperate run through the night, but a cold, sterile examination room in Constantinople. Jones and Hill now had to fool trained medical professionals. The stakes were impossibly high. Failure meant severe punishment, possibly execution. Success meant repatriation. For hours, they were questioned and observed. Jones ranted about spirits controlling him, his eyes wide with feigned terror. Hill sat mute, tracing patterns on the floor, his being yoked to Jones's madness. The doctors debated. Their symptoms didn't align with known illnesses, but their behavior was undeniably unhinged. Weighing the evidence against the prospect of caring for 2 hopelessly insane enemy officers, the medical board made its decision. On October 17, 1918, Lieutenants E.H. Jones and C.W. Hill were certified as mentally unstable, boarded a British hospital ship, and were officially repatriated. But the performance was not over. Breaking character on the British hospital vessel HMS Huntsend meant a telegram could race back to Constantinople, leading to their return and courts-martial for malingering. Everything they had endured for 8 months would collapse into disgrace. The ship became their most dangerous stage, surrounded by the wounded, the genuinely shell-shocked, and medical staff who had seen every variety of war trauma. They had to maintain absolute consistency. The ship's corridors smelled of antiseptic and gangrene. Real casualties filled the berths, men with shattered limbs and memories that made them scream in the night. Jones and Hill moved among them, 2 more broken pieces of the war machine, unable to stop performing. Medical orderlies watched. Ship's officers observed. Jones continued his ranting, his conversations with invisible spirits. Hill remained locked in catatonic silence, responding only to Jones, his movements slow and disconnected. They inhabited their madness every waking and sleeping hour. Jones crying out from nightmares, Hill lying rigid and unmoving. As the ship steamed westward, each day brought them closer to England and potential exposure. The crucial moment arrived when the ship's senior medical officer, a physician with decades of experience, decided to conduct his own examination. The diagnosis from Constantinople troubled him. The symptoms did not align with classical presentations. He ordered both men to the medical bay. This was the final obstacle. A 15-minute examination by an expert trained to detect exactly their kind of deception. A single notation in his log could destroy everything. They entered the bay separately, Jones first. The room smelled of carbolic acid. The medical officer, a man in his 50s with steady eyes that had seen every kind of lie, sat ready. He gestured for Jones to sit. Jones stood, eyes darting, lips moving soundlessly. The officer made a note. He asked for Jones's name, rank, and squadron. Jones's answers wandered, blaming spirits for interrupting his thoughts. The physician leaned forward, asking specific questions about symptoms, pre-capture mental state, and family history. Jones and Hill had rehearsed endlessly, but performance under expert scrutiny was different. One inconsistency, one moment of clarity would unravel the deception. The officer asked Jones to perform simple tasks, touch his nose, count backward from 20. Jones complied, but his movements were jerky, his counting interrupted by arguments with invisible presences. The physician watched, his pen moving. He asked about the séances at Yozgad. Jones's pupils dilated. He began to shake, describing the spirits taking control. The certainty that forces beyond understanding had driven him to madness. His voice rose as he backed against the wall. A man trapped in a nightmare he had to make real. The medical officer approached, speaking calmly, and placed a hand on Jones's shoulder. Jones flinched as if burned. "The spirits," he gasped. "They're angry." The officer withdrew his hand, made another note, and sent for Hill. Hill entered like a sleepwalker, his eyes vacant, his movements lacking volition. He sat when positioned, but did not respond to questions. The physician's voice grew louder, almost shouting, but failed to penetrate Hill's apparent catatonia. He tried different approaches, moving suddenly, mentioning home and family. Hill remained locked in his internal prison. The only response came when the officer mentioned Jones. Hill's eyes shifted slightly towards the door. The physician noted this. He asked about their relationship, but Hill only began tracing repetitive geometric shapes on the armrest of his chair, a compulsive mechanical action. The doctor spoke of England and freedom, but Hill showed no recognition. After observing him in silence, the physician saw no change, the same vacant stare, the same rhythmic tracing. The officer called Jones back in, positioning them in chairs before him. Jones immediately grew agitated, speaking to Hill as his only anchor in a spirit-haunted chaos. Hill responded only to Jones's voice, turning his head slightly, his hand reaching for Jones's sleeve. The physician asked rapid-fire questions, seeking inconsistency. Their accounts matched the Constantinople report perfectly. The lies embedded in memory through 8 months of constant repetition. The medical officer made his final notes and told them they could leave. Jones guided Hill to his feet like a keeper leading a patient. Back at his desk, the physician stared at the file. Something felt wrong. The symptoms were too theatrical, too aligned with a layman's idea of madness, but they were also too sustained, too resistant to every test. There was the Turkish certification, and the political reality that 2 insane British officers still held by the Turks was an embarrassment to be rid of. He signed the form confirming the diagnosis and noting them fit for transfer to mental health facilities in England. He closed the file. Jones and Hill maintained their performance for the remainder of the voyage. They did not celebrate or relax. They stayed locked in their roles hour after hour as the ship steamed north toward England. The psychological toll of maintaining perfect insanity while sane exceeded any physical hardship of Yozgad. At least in camp, they had private moments. On the ship, someone was always watching. On November 2nd, 1918, HMS Huntsend entered Portsmouth Harbour. Jones and Hill were transferred to Netley Hospital, the designated facility for mental cases. Placed in a secure ward, they underwent intake examinations. Jones ranted about spirits following him to England. Hill remained mute. The Netley physicians noted them as suffering from severe psychosis induced by their imprisonment. They recommended extended observation, assigning them separate rooms under constant supervision. Guards stood outside not to prevent escape, but self-harm. They had fooled Turkish guards, Turkish doctors, British naval physicians, and now British psychiatric specialists. But they could not stop. The war was still ongoing, and their fellow prisoners remained at Yozgad. Prematurely revealing their deception could bring retribution upon those left behind. For 6 more days, they sustained the act. Jones continued his spirit-haunted ravings. Hill maintained his catatonic withdrawal. Their case was unusual enough that senior consultants were brought in, each consultation another high-stakes performance. They passed every examination. Their perfect consistency paradoxically made them believable. True malingerers usually broke under sustained scrutiny. Jones and Hill had been scrutinized for months and never wavered. The doctors concluded their insanity was genuine. Then, on November 11th, 1918, the armistice was signed. The war ended. News spread through Netley. Their fellow prisoners would be released. There was no longer any risk. That evening, after 8 months of sustained performance, Jones called for the senior physician. When the doctor arrived, Jones spoke clearly and sanely, explaining the entire deception, the Spook board, the fake treasure, the cultivated insanity, and the continued performance. Hill, summoned to the room, corroborated every detail in his first coherent sentences since arriving. The physician stared, his expression cycling through disbelief, anger, and finally, reluctant admiration. He reviewed their files, realizing 2 British officers had perpetrated one of the most sophisticated deceptions in military history, fooling medical boards across 2 countries. He asked why they hadn't revealed the truth upon reaching England. Jones explained the risk to their fellow prisoners. The physician, simultaneously furious and fascinated, took notes. Finally, he closed his notebook. Their deception, he told them, still constituted malingering, and there would be an inquiry. But given the circumstances and the war's end, he would recommend no charges be filed. They were free to go. Jones and Hill left Netley Hospital on November 13, 1918, as themselves for the first time in 8 months. They walked into an England transformed by armistice, their success feeling strange after so long performing madness. Returning to normalcy required conscious effort. They had escaped Yozgad without leaving it, defeating their captors with performance, not violence. It was perhaps the most unusual, successful escape in modern military history, proving what imagination and commitment could achieve. But the cost was invisible. They had spent 8 months deliberately fragmenting their own psyches, living a lie so completely that the boundary between performance and reality had blurred. The psychological scars would remain long after the physical wounds of war healed. Jones and Hill were home, sane and safe, but neither man would ever be quite the same. The performance had ended. Its consequences were just beginning. As the hospital ship steamed away from Turkish shores, the medical staff kept a wary eye on their 2 insane patients. Then, once safely in the Mediterranean, Jones and Hill simply stopped. They shaved, cleaned their uniforms, and calmly reported to the ship's senior British officer, explaining the entire 2-year deception in perfect detail. The ship's doctors were left speechless. Upon returning to England, Jones promptly wrote to the War Office, humorously detailing how he and Hill had used a Ouija board and feigned lunacy to trick the entire Turkish command at Yozgad. Their story became legendary, and Jones published his account in the 1919 book The Road to En-Dor, a title referencing a biblical tale of a medium. The escape remains one of the most brilliant and unconventional in military history, a testament to the power of psychological warfare. It was achieved not with shovels and wire cutters, but with a piece of wood, a glass tumbler, and an unwavering commitment to one of the most elaborate acting performances ever staged. The War Office debriefers, who sat across from Jones and Hill in November 1918, were more interested in what Jones had gathered during his months of apparent madness than in the Ouija board theatrics. His detailed maps of Yozgad's layout, observations of Turkish troop movements, and a census of prisoner populations across multiple camps were all compiled, while guards believed him too insane to notice anything. The intelligence summary, filed weeks later, noted that his information on Turkish railway infrastructure matched aerial reconnaissance, and his observations of guard force reductions confirmed that the Ottoman Empire had been stripping garrisons for the collapsing Palestinian front. Jones had been watching, counting, and remembering while pretending to commune with spirits. The debriefers classified this intelligence as confidential, but they left the theatrical method that produced it unclassified, deeming it too absurd for anyone to believe, much less replicate. After the war, Jones returned to civilian life with the Indian Forest Service and never wore his uniform again. Hill stayed with the military, joining the newly formed Royal Air Force, but requested a posting far from the Middle East. The nightmares, his sister later recalled, lasted until the 1930s. They were not nightmares of capture or imprisonment, but of the performance itself, of the camp commandant Kazim Bey's face as he ordered Jones beaten, of the terrifying moment during a séance when Hill feared Jones had actually lost his mind. The line between performance and reality had blurred so completely that Hill sometimes woke uncertain which side of sanity he had been on. He never spoke publicly of Yozgad. When Jones's book arrived in 1919, Hill read it once and placed it on a shelf where he would not see its spine. Recognition for both men was quiet. There were no medals for the escape itself, as it broke no enemy lines and secured no intelligence that affected the war's outcome. They had simply gotten themselves out, using a method the War Office didn't know how to categorize. The Distinguished Service Order Jones received in 1920 cited gallant service and devotion to duty, but made no mention of Ouija boards or feigned insanity. Official military records have always preferred the vague to the bizarre. The forgetting began almost immediately, buried under post-war demobilization and the public's exhaustion with war stories. Jones's book sold modestly, with reviews praising its ingenuity but questioning its believability. The Times literary supplement suggested extensive embellishment, while a reviewer for the Daily Telegraph wrote that the account strains credulity beyond the breaking point. The book was out of print by 1923. Meanwhile, lecture halls and bookstores were filled with stories of traditional escapes involving tunnels, wire cutting, and disguises. These narratives fit the public's understanding of conventional courage. Jones and Hill's psychological operation, their weaponization of spiritualism and madness, seemed too strange and theatrical to stand alongside stories of men crawling through mud or hiking across mountain ranges. It was filed in the public consciousness, when remembered at all, as an amusing oddity. The military, however, never fully forgot. At the Intelligence Corps depot in Winchester, the debriefing of Jones and Hill remained in restricted files. The case summary: subject feigned insanity to manipulate captors, maintained deception for 18 months, extracted intelligence while appearing incapacitated, intrigued a generation of officers who would later establish the foundations of wartime deception operations. By the 1930s, references to the Yozgad case appeared in internal discussions, though always with caveats about its unique, unreplicatable nature. You couldn't teach feigned insanity or standardize a Ouija board operation. The case existed in classified files as proof that psychological manipulation could achieve what physical force could not, but it offered no template. It was studied, noted, then filed away again. Hill died in 1943, still serving with the RAF, never having publicly discussed Yozgad. Jones passed away in 1962 after a long career in Indian forestry. Their obituaries were brief, vaguely mentioning Great War service, but not their extraordinary escape. A 1953 BBC radio interview Jones recorded was never aired, the producer feeling audiences wouldn't believe it. Discovered decades later, the transcript reveals Jones's frustration in a marginal note: every word true, wish it weren't. The book remained out of print, and his papers sat uncatalogued at the Imperial War Museum for 15 years. By 1970, the physical and human evidence had vanished. The camp was demolished, its guards and prisoners scattered or dead, and the story of Yozgad had become a forgotten footnote in Great War histories. The rediscovery began unexpectedly in 1977. Major Philip Toucey, the British officer whose WW's experience at a Thai POW camp partly inspired The Bridge on the River Kwai, mentioned Jones's book in a lecture at the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst. Toucey stressed that the key lesson was not the Ouija board, but the exploitation of captor psychology and belief systems. A young military historian in the audience, Dr. Margaret Makepeace Hunt, was intrigued. After locating a rare copy, she spent months cross-referencing the account with newly opened Ottoman military archives. The records confirmed everything: medical reports on their insanity, transfer orders, and most remarkably, the 1931 memoir of the Commandant, Kazim Bey. He had devoted 4 pages to the English mediums and their supernatural abilities, having died in 1930 without ever learning he had been deceived. Makepeace Hunt's 1980 article in the Journal of Military History, Psychological Resistance in Turkish Captivity, sparked a revival. A British publisher reprinted The Road to En-Dor in 1982, reaching a new audience of military psychologists and intelligence officers. At the U.S. Army's intelligence school at Fort Huachuca, an instructor added the Yozgad case to his curriculum in 1985. It served not as a replicable method, but as a prime example of understanding and manipulating an interrogator's assumptions. Jones had recognized his captor's need to believe in something beyond physical reality and had ridden that belief to freedom. The lesson wasn't to use a Ouija board, it was to identify what your captor wants to believe, then become that belief. The case also entered the curriculum at the UK's Joint Services Survival Evasion, or Resistance and Escape SERE school, where it was used to exemplify the resist by all means available clause of the Code of Conduct. The Jones Hill story offered proof that prisoners could conduct psychological operations against their captors without physical tools. Lesson plans reframed the deception in clinical intelligence terminology, focusing on how Subject Jones maintained operational security for a deception operation lasting 18 months and achieved both intelligence and extraction objectives. SERE instructors used Yozgad to teach that resistance is mental before it is physical, exploiting a captor's psychology rather than confronting their strength. Wider recognition came in 1990 with a BBC radio drama based on the book, which spurred public interest and led researchers to Jones's uncatalogued papers. Among them were sketches of the Ouija board, coded séance notes, and the actual glass tumbler. In 1992, the Imperial War Museum mounted an exhibition, Deception Operations, from Yozgad to Gulf War, placing Jones's improvised theatrics as a direct precursor to systematic military deception like Operation Fortitude. Yozgad was no longer an oddity, but a foundational example of psyops. Modern military interest in the Yozgad case centers on three applications. First, in interrogation resistance training, it demonstrates how to manipulate an interrogator's inherent biases. Second, in intelligence schools, it illustrates the principle of building the legend, maintaining a cover identity under constant scrutiny. Third, in military history, it's studied as a key pre-World War II deception operation, sharing principles with later strategic deceptions, understanding the enemy's beliefs, providing supporting evidence, and maintaining consistency. The psychological price of the performance was starkly revealed in an unsent 1938 letter from Hill to Jones, donated to the RAF Museum in 1995. "I'm back in that room, holding the glass, watching your eyes," he wrote, "and I cannot tell, even now, whether you were acting or whether you'd truly gone mad." This letter revealed the trauma the official accounts missed, the lingering cost of weaponizing their own minds for 18 months. The distinction between their escape and traditional attempts was not one of valor, but of methodology. Today, The Road to En-Dor is recommended reading at military staff colleges for specialists in psychological operations and intelligence. The Imperial War Museum's permanent galleries include a display case with a reproduction of Jones's Ouija board and a first edition of his book. The text concludes, "Jones and Hill's escape demonstrated that psychological warfare could be waged by prisoners against captors, a lesson that influenced Allied deception operations in subsequent conflicts." The men's graves in Gloucestershire and Bedfordshire bear no mention of Yozgad. Their shared story is absent from their final resting places. Their true memorial exists in classified files, military curricula, and museum displays. The physical world of Yozgad is lost, the camp gone, the commandant's memoir untranslated, the witnesses dead. What remains is Jones's book, now understood not as an entertaining oddity, but as a primary source document on psychological resistance, and with it, a lesson taught to military personnel who might face captivity. Resistance takes countless forms, but all require the same foundation: understanding your enemy's mind and exploiting the space between what they know and what they believe. That space, Jones proved, can be wide enough to walk through to freedom, even if the journey costs you part of yourself along the way.